So happiness for me is making connections. There's nothing more fun for me than taking in new information or meeting somebody new or doing something new and finding an unexpected, potentially useful use for it. Also, my greyhounds.
And your greyhounds. Yeah. So
And my
making
greyhounds.
connections, Tamsen Webster, you make a lot of connections in your new book, giving them something they can't, or give me the exact title of your book.
Say what they can't unhear.
Say what you can unhear. That's right. Yep. Because I want to say something about seeing something, but it says something that they can't
Say
unhear.
something.
It's a great book. I finished it this morning. It is
Thank you.
wonderful. So congratulations. So talk to me about connections first. What does connection mean to you?
Oh gosh. I mean, I think it's just, for me, a connection requires at least two things that, for whatever reason, seems to have something that relate to each other. They don't necessarily have to have something in common, but there's a compatibility between two things. And I don't mean just things, obviously. I do mean people, I mean ideas and all of that. But for me, finding kind of an unexpected compatibility or just finding a new piece of information or meeting somebody new that has a new piece of information or a new idea or a new way of seeing the world. I just love that. I don't know. I think the world is a cool place. And, there's just, finding ways to see how it fits together and being surprised by that or being delighted by that or sometimes being horrified by that. It all, I don't know. I like to say that, my animal familiar would be a magpie. I mean, I just love finding shiny things, shiny ideas. And kind of holding on to them and sharing them, actually, just so that, because they might be useful to someone someday, to someone somewhere. And that's what I love to do.
You do that very well. You have probably the biggest, I bet you probably have the biggest swipe file of anybody that I know. I know that you've publicly shared a lot of stuff and hashtag it with swipe file and all of that. So how did you get started with that, Tamsen? Because you haven't always been the amazing message raconteur that you are today.
No, honestly, it started probably about 10 years ago now, where at least 10 years ago now, where, I was doing doing a lot of work in content, doing a lot of work in messaging, marketing, storytelling, presenting, communications. And at the time, I was surrounded by people who just always seemed to have the most interesting little piece of information or nugget or story or analogy or metaphor or something. Chief among them, my husband, Tom Webster. And I was just like, man, I want stuff like that. Like, where does that come from? My boss at the time was also just marvelous about finding, again, unexpected, interesting things. So I made it a point. I said, well, I'm just going to start expanding what I'm reading and where I'm reading and what I'm looking at and whatever, just to start collecting things in my head that might be potentially useful. And it doesn't take long before you realize, A, there's a lot of great stuff out there, and B, there's no possible way I could use it all. And C, well, then why not share it with other people? Because here's a way, very practically, to be present in certain social spaces without always being me, right? It's just basically saying, here, let me be of use to other people by sharing something that may be useful to them, either because it's interesting or because it relates to something they may be thinking about, or it might be a really fascinating, unexpected, new, different way to illustrate a point or something like that. And so it just started that way. And I just, the kind of daily scan of information and sources continues to be one of my practices. I'm not always great about getting this white file out there. Took about a year off as I was trying to figure out how does it fit in with everything. But I still, read every day, and I still kind of, save everything up. And, but keep your eyes on this space. The Swipe File may relaunch as a podcast later this year.
Ooh, that would be awesome. I'd love to hear that, because that's one of the favorite things that you do is you put stuff together in different ways that I would not think about with your swipe file and the way that you think and all of that. So talk to me a little bit about the genesis of this new book, because this is the same but different than what you've done before, I would say.
Yeah, I mean, I think it is very much the philosophy behind what I do, what I've done before. I mean, I have been interested in lasting change, in lasting transformational change since I was 17. And so for a
Wow.
very, very long time, because that when I was 17 was the first time I had a panic attack bad enough to send me to a hospital. And if you have ever struggled with panic or anxiety or know somebody who has, then you may know that once you have a panic attack, then you're pretty focused on not having another one. And it took me another 17 years before I figured out how to not have them. And I haven't for another 17 years. So I like next year, I'm going to not be able to say it's been 17, 17, 17, but now, right now it is. And so that was, for a long time, that was in the personal part of my life where I was just interested in it because, it started with panic, but then, after college and grad school, I was also 50 pounds heavier than I am right now. I'd started smoking as an attempt to kind of deal with my anxiety. And so I was not a terribly healthy person. And, and then in my day job, I was first a change management consultant, and then I was doing a lot of work in marketing and branding. And in a lot of ways, it was obvious with change management, but with marketing and branding and positioning and those kinds of things, it's still very much about trying to create long-lasting change in people's thinking or behavior. And as I started to learn my lessons for myself in kind of transformational change, lost the weight, stopped smoking, lost the weight. I started to figure out how I could get on a personal level, pay that forward. And paying that forward on a personal level, first and foremost, started as me moonlighting as a Weight Watchers leader for 13 years. And what I started to figure out was the first thing I did was I started to bring aspects of what I knew from communication into like professional communication into the meeting room. But it wasn't very long before I was starting to learn lessons in the meeting room about how to help people create transformational change individually. I started to take those lessons back into the professional world because in a lot of cases, the things that I saw work and a lot of the research I was doing on my own to find out what makes somebody make a decision, how do they process information, like what makes someone, what does create that kind of lasting change, actually worked better in the meeting room than the stuff that I was officially taught about how you're supposed to do marketing messaging, sales messaging, change communications. And the more that I brought these lessons that I saw work in real life to my professional work, the better results I was seeing in the professional work. And so for a long time, I was, over time, these two different things started to come together because, in my mind, you can't get to organizational change, market level change, planetary change, as I do a lot of work with green and climate startups, without having change happen at the individual level first. And so just over all these years, so 30 years now, putting all this together, 33 years putting all this together, not that old. I had just developed these concepts that really guided how I approach this, how I approach both personal and professional change. But they're also the principles that guide the advice that I give to my clients. And, I just kept seeing that there just wasn't anything else out there that was representing this point of view. Not only how, like, particularly in business change and those kinds of things. Plenty of stuff on driving action, plenty of stuff on persuasion and influence and getting people to do things. But there weren't things that really represented how do you do this long term and how do you do it in a way that doesn't rely on extrinsic motivators or threats, or that doesn't feel manipulative or doesn't feel coercive. And so I was like, well, since I'm not seeing anybody else put it out there, maybe I will. And thus Say What They Can't Unhear was born.
Cool. Cool. Yeah, I have not read any other book like this, which is really saying something because I've read a ton of books, and you talk, and there's a lot of story in here, and
Mm,
you say really clearly in the beginning of the book that a story is an argument.
mm,
I think that's really interesting. So tell me,
mm.
what does that mean in the parlance of your book?
Yeah, I mean, so that's it's not my phrase. It's been a kind of an old storytelling maxim that a story is an argument. You can see that the general idea most clearly in fables and fairy tales, and fables in particular, because those are essentially an argument for a particular course of action. And in the case of like fables, they actually tell you what what they want that conclusion to be. That slow and steady wins the race, or something like that. But really, any story you can think of, your favorite movie, your favorite novel, something like that, is essentially presenting a case for this is the way or not the way to get this thing that this character wanted in the beginning. And so how that comes to play with the book is that when we are making any kind of decision, there is a story behind it in our minds. There is a of a it's logical. It may not always be rational. Connection that we create, that if I do this, this will happen. It's this usually unconscious cause and effect relationship that we make, and we really don't do anything. We don't take any action unless it satisfies that internal argument in our heads that we're usually not even aware of. So, the reason why that's so important, if you are a leader, if you're trying to inspire change in somebody else, in yourself, that's important, because if there isn't a story that's stronger than the one that's standing in the way of change right now, it's not going to happen. If there is a story that doesn't make sense, that change is not going to happen. And so part of the whole philosophy of the book, and it's very much the philosophy behind my first book, Find Your Red Thread, is that if we want someone to truly understand, and if we really want them to be invested in this change, if we want them to believe enough in it to act on it, then we have to build the story they're going to tell themselves, which at its heart is quite literally an argument that if this is true and this is true, then this will be true. Or that if I do this, this will happen because these other things are true. And so that's really what the book is about, is it is really creating the case of, we have to understand that every decision has a story, because no case for change will be as effective as one that is structured as a story, and one that has the elements of an argument in it.
Hmm. That's interesting. So with that, you make the case that smart, capable, and good is one of the big key kind of core who we are, what we do, why we do things type of story. So explain that a little bit more, because I mean, it seems like it makes a lot of sense. I want to be smart, capable, and good,
Right.
but not the way that you put it together in that way. Until you do,
Yeah.
I'm like, oh yeah, okay, now it makes even more sense.
Yeah. I mean, so part of the thinking behind the book is, and the realization I had around this book, was that while business seems to have not cracked the code of transformational change and long-term change, there are plenty of other areas of scholarship and practice that have. So, for instance, psychology, cognitive neuroscience, behavioral economics, adult learning, which is my current passion. We figured out, like, they've figured out what's necessary for transformational change. And this idea of, I put it in the book as people wanting to be seen as smart, capable, and good is a key factor in all of those other, findings about what creates transformational change. Is that, some folks call it the self concept, for some folks it's identity. It all basically means the same thing, but we want to be seen as smart, capable, and good. We don't always have to believe that we are, but it's really, really important for us as humans to be perceived that way. And if we understand that, and we agree that that's true, then it starts to make a lot of what we typically do to try to convince someone to buy or to change or to do something different. All of a sudden, it makes us go, oh, because a lot of what we're doing when we're setting up a case for change is we're essentially saying to people, Well, you will become smart, capable, and good when you do this. We make it conditional. But if you think about it, that means that we don't actually believe that about them right now. And while in the short term, someone might be like, well, I'm going to, I'm going to do this so that you think better of me. Long term, that actually doesn't work because they're like, wait a minute. Our self concept will not allow us to think long term that we did something not smart, not capable, not good. So, because that is such a critical piece, right? The line that I offer in the book is that it is up to us to defend that desire to be seen as smart, capable, and good as fiercely as the person that we're talking to will. And for me, what has worked very well and what I've seen work very well with others and with clients is that it really means starting from the perspective that the person that you're talking to or the people, if that's an audience or whatever, is already smart, capable, and good. And so that what that does is it puts you in a very different mental perspective on how to talk to them. It generally allows you to see better why they are doing the thing that you don't agree with now, because that's the question you ask yourself where you're like, that's so crazy. That's so stupid that somebody's doing that. And if you stop and say, no, I'm going to look at this in terms of why would a smart, capable, good person do this? And then all of a sudden you might be like, because they think it's going to provide them, I don't know, some sense of security. That's what conventional wisdom says. Something, it allows you to be able to acknowledge that, validate it. And then once they feel like they've been seen and heard, then thanks to another trick of the brain, reciprocity, they're going to be much more open to something else. They're going to be much more open to your point of view because you have seen and validated theirs. And so, again, just as a quick example, psychologists know this, psychiatry know this, behavioral science knows this, because it's in those areas, it's known as unconditional positive regard, right? That it's you enter a therapy relationship. Your therapist is supposed to start from the perspective that you already have the resources that you need and that you are capable of solving whatever challenges in front of you, and their job is to help you get there. We know from all of the studies behind that's more effective. And so this is simply kind of my call to arms to say, let's bring that same knowledge that is evidence-based as being successful into our professional communications and maybe into our personal ones as well.
Yeah, I like the duality of your message about how this can help our personal life as well as our work life. I think that's really, really powerful. With that, you talk about how the longer someone holds a belief, the stronger it's going to be. And that is so darn true. I mean, we see that we're in the midst of election season here.
Yes.
So we're absolutely seeing that is true. So tell me a little bit about, give me a story or a lesson about how and why that's true.
Well, I mean, I think that's one of the things I was trying to do with the book all the way through is to base it on principles that we know intuitively are true, and then support that with the evidence and with the research that validates that that's true. And so, we know we've experienced the fact that the longer we believe something, the stronger that belief. And much of the time we take that to be a problem. Right. When it comes to getting somebody else or ourselves to change, we're like, well, this is what they believe. And so what we try to do is we try to change that belief. There's a name for that. There's a name for the fact that those beliefs are standing in the way. It's called cognitive inertia. It's just like physics, where, a physical thing like a body at rest stays at rest. Same thing is true about our ideas and the stories we tell ourselves, is that, the longer they stay there, the more fixed in place they get to be. And so it makes sense at one level that if you're trying to get someone to do something and they've got this big old strong belief standing in the way, that we're trying to like push it out of the way and get something else and give them some new belief to do that. Something like, you can do it, instead of like, if somebody's like, no, I can't, I'm not capable. I've failed a million times before. And it's one of those things where, what I've seen is, if you try then to get someone to believe something new, that they want something different than they currently want now, which is what 99% of marketing is based on, or to believe something different than they do right now, which is what 99% of sales is based on. Think about that. In that case, cognitive inertia is working against you in two different ways. Number one, you are asking this brand new, you're asking someone to take on some new belief in the face of this one that has served them perfectly well in their mind for a very long time. So you're lucky if they even pay attention to you, but they probably won't, because their first reaction is like, well, I don't want that. And I don't believe that. Therefore, I'm not going to listen to any more information. That's how our brains work. We don't tend to pay attention to things that don't align with how we already see the world. So let's say you do get their attention, and let's say they're like, okay, yeah, I can. All right, well, the first time that belief really gets put to the test, and you've got this new baby, like weak belief that's still trying to like get traction with you. And then, I mean, it's not like the other belief went away, right? So in that first battle of belief, what happens, like what's going to happen is that new baby weak, exactly, like the old one's going to come right back in. And so it might leave us to saying, well, what the heck can we do? But this is one of those lessons I learned as a weight loss coach, which was, okay, let's say someone does believe that they are genetically predisposed to this, and maybe they are. Who knows? It doesn't matter whether it's true or not, because they believe it. And or they have, let's say, not been successful over and over again. They're getting into this point where they're just like, maybe I just can't do it, right? And so that's one of those times where I found it really effective to say, well, all right, let's put this away. Like, what are some of the other things you do in your life that you do really, really well? Like, what are some of the things that you're really proud of, the things that you're super strong in? And then, they would say something like, oh, I'm a really good planner. I'm really good at taking care of other people. Okay, then how do we take the belief that exists over here, I'm a really good planner, and how can we put that to work over here? Again, you don't have to believe it's that you can do it right away. You just can't believe that you can't. So it's one of those things. It's like, all right, well, if you've not tried planning before and you're a great planner, would you be open to trying like, taking and mapping over this great skill you have over here to see if that's going to work better? Because now what we're going to do is to sub in that equally strong or stronger belief to say, you know what? Actually, I'm a really good planner. And because I know I'm a really good planner, and so much of my success is going to be making sure I've got the right things with me and the right kind of foods that I want to have with me in the moment, that's why I do believe it might be possible that I can do this. And I think that that's a really key piece. But we can see it, the same thing at play in a lot of other places. Actually, one of my favorite places to think about this is actually to look at even things like a body at rest, days at rest. Like I didn't do it intentionally, but by making that case for like, hey, maybe instead of challenging beliefs, we should exchange them. I actually could have brought in something that to be true, that the longer you believe something, the stronger you believe it. And that may on the surface of it sound like a negative, but again, once I explain it, now I can take something that you already know to be true and say, well, for the exact reasons why it can be a problem, it could also be a really great opportunity and a new place for us to look at how can we create a change that really has a chance of sticking long term.
Wow. So is that the building bridges of belief piece that you talk about as well?
Yeah, I mean, all of these, it was an interesting challenge because all of these principles are very interconnected. So, the first time I fired off all these, like all my thoughts about this, there were like 18 of them. And then I was like, well, it's not bad. I mean, Phil M. Jones's incredible book, Exactly What to Say, has 17 things. And so I was like, I've got one more. But when I really sat down to evaluate them, I said, well, some of the shades of difference here between these are not big enough to make a whole separate thing out of them. So let me try to group them in ways that make sense. So absolutely, this idea of kind of using someone's strong pre-existing belief is a foundational concept for this idea of building bridges as belief, which I create as a counterpoint to leaps of faith, because, and in fact, that's a lot of times what we're asking people to do. We're saying, I'm going to put all the risk of change on you, even though I'm the one that's asking for the change. And I'm just going to tell you, trust me, it's going to bring all these benefits to you. And you're going to ask me why, and I'm going to tell you about all my features, and I'm going to trot out client testimonials, but I'm actually generally not going to give you anything that makes you go, oh, that makes sense. Why I would get those results from that piece. And so, that's where starting with somebody's known beliefs are about, well, how do you believe it works, right? Like, if you believe that the more perspectives you take on something, the better you can see it. And I can use that as part of my case for why we need to bring in different voices, more people, why we need to make this group bigger or whatever. Then all of a sudden, again, you may not change right away, but in that context, that phrase may be something that you can't unhear. So what we're trying to do with these bridges of belief is basically, it builds on another concept from one of my friends, a human connection expert, great author of one of my favorite books called Magic Words, not Jonah Berger, though that's a great book too. It's a different Magic Words by Tim David. And Tim talks about getting little yeses, right? Because a lot of times if we ask somebody for a big yes, then the risk is big too. But if we ask for somebody with a little yes, and what I'm, in the context of what I'm talking about, I talk about as 1,000 little yeses, that really this case for change, particularly transformational change, is the process of, maybe it's not 1,000, but it's much little yeses that you're trying to get secure, kind of a series of understanding and agreement. It starts with something as small as like, here's a shared goal that I think we both want. Do you want that? Yes. Do you want the answer to this question? Are you interested in the answer to this question? Right. That's even a more smart, capable, good way, supportive way to ask it. Like, are you interested in the answer to this question? Yes. Would you agree that this principle is true, that every decision has a story? Maybe you need to explain that, but they're like, yeah, I would agree that's true. And would you agree that the stories, the actions we agree with are based on beliefs that we already have? Yep. Generally, like, if something really resonates for you, it's because it aligns with what you already agree with. Okay, well then, can you see how, if we're trying to build buy-in for belief or a change, that it makes sense for us to build a story, build an argument based on elements that people have already bought into? Yeah, great. Would you like to know how we could do that? Right. So it's little yeses all the way through, but little yeses that are based on things that, if I'm the one making that change, if I'm the one that is asking for the change, I believe to my core are true, that this will give an answer to this question, that this principle is true and it applies here. And I am then taking on the risk that you may not agree. But to me, that puts the risk of the change in the right place. It puts it where it belongs, on the person asking for it. And if it's you asking it of yourself, it is so much about figuring out, okay, how can I same thing. How can I build a bridge of belief? Instead of, like, anytime you're like, do I believe this? No. Find something else that you do. Do I want this? If the answer is yes, I do, but, like, again, put it into a battle. Like, say, would you want this more in this situation? Yes. All right. So then we need to, like, turn up the stakes on it a little bit. So it applies because we don't stop being people when we go to work.
Cool. Wow. That's super powerful, Tamsen. So with that, I've got one more question, but before I ask it, I just want to encourage folks, if you're listening and you're like, ooh, I want to get a copy of the book, you can pre-order the book at littlechangebook.com. The book is Say What They Can't Unhear. It's a fantastic book. I finished it this morning. I love it. It's a great book, really easy to read. Looks like it's going to be really easy to implement too. Although there's a lot of stuff in there, Tamsen, that I got questions about, which is why you're here today. So
yes. Well, yeah. And it's also why I created, and it's launching next month, the Message Design Institute, because I wanted to give people in addition to the red thread, which is absolutely a way to put these principles into practice, more ways, different ways, quick ways, short ways, things that allow us to make sure that we're not just getting, that structure of story that people will tell themselves, but also helping give people the tools they need for really understanding how do we get to those beliefs? How do we get to one of those core cases that really makes the difference between a short-term action and a long-term change?
Yeah. Wow. Awesome. MessageDesignInstitute.com is that website for those. I checked that out today, signed up for the new newsletter. So excited to read more about that, of course. So with that, Tamsen, where do we get started? What is the first thing or second thing that we can do so we can get started along this journey towards saying what they can't unhear?
Yeah, I know the answer clear. And my only hesitation is I always feel like I say the same thing with this, but all of it starts with that question. And that is yet another place I'm discovering that I am departing from so much conventional wisdom, because so much out there says, what's the problem? What's the problem? What's the problem you solve? What's the problem people are dealing with? What's the problem? Make the pain of change, make the pain of the status quo exceed the pain of change. Like, dial up the stakes. It's the problem. Well, there's a problem with the problem. First and foremost, it puts people into a fear and a negative state. And people can't learn when they're anxious. An anxious brain can't learn. That's not opinion. That's science. And so while people may act when they're in an anxious state, it's an irrational action. And so when they have an opportunity for their brains to take back over, the rational part, early the prefrontal cortex part of their brain to take back over, that's a lot of the times where you see somebody who said yes quickly start to come back out of it. And buyer's remorse, they start backpedaling on an agreement. They start reverting back to their original state. So, when it comes to really figuring out, okay, well, how do we make that stick? I completely forgot my train of thought. That happens sometimes. What were we talking about?
You're talking about how to get started.
Yeah, how to get started. Sorry. Yes. So instead of the problem, this is where I'm trying to go with that. Instead of how to get started, I think what makes a lot of sense is, instead of framing it as a problem, frame it as a question that they are trying to answer. Because any unanswered question to our brain actually does represent some level of a problem, because it creates what's known as a knowledge gap. You actively want an answer to this question, and you actively do not have an answer to it that is sufficient for you right now, either because there isn't one, or whatever you have said does not make sense. This question is so powerful, and it sounds like such an easy exercise. And so anytime I'm talking to clients or prospective clients about this, and I'm like, just start here, figure out what the question is. Here's what it needs to do. Here's the criteria it needs to meet. And they'll be like, oh, no problem. And then they'll come back and they're like, oh my gosh, I don't even know. Absolutely. Because the thing is that the question that somebody's asking turns out to be incredibly powerful, because the question that comes out and the way that you choose to frame it as being representative of the people that you are trying to serve, or that is representative of what you really see that changes as answering. Each of those words captures aspects of mindset. It captures level of awareness of what the real problem actually is. But here's the thing, by focusing on the question that you're answering, and let me add to that some of this criteria to get started. 1, it needs to be a question that your ideal audience for this change is actively and knowingly asking right now. And this is one of the places when I talk to people about this, they go like it blows their mind, because I'm like, listen, if they do not have your real problem, they don't know they have the real problem that you and all your current messaging is based around, how are they ever going to find you? They're not. So you've got to start with the question they're asking, right, where they have a knowledge gap and where you're filling in. And your real problem enters the situation after that, when you say, hey, one of the reasons why you're having trouble finding an answer to this question is because, right, Then you introduce this real problem, because this is the thing that's actually getting in the way. So we actually have to solve this thing first before you can get the answer to this question. But don't worry, because this other thing is true. If we do this change, we make this change, we're going to solve for both things, right? We're not only going to solve for this real problem that's getting in the way, but we're also going to make sure that you get this thing that you're looking for. So that to me is one of the great places to start, is with that this question that your audience is actively and knowingly asking right now. And I'm going to add a couple other constraints to this, just to get, again, A, to help, but B, because the better you can do this, the more effective your messaging is always going to be. This needs to be as urgent and an important version of that question as possible. So there's a big difference, for instance, between someone saying, how can I feel more fulfilled? And how can I get more time to spend with my family? Now, I may feel more fulfilled if I have more time to spend with my family, but do you feel how one of them is much more specific and much more urgent? And, if you're a fan of Maslow's hierarchy of needs, it's lower on the level. That's what I'm talking about. Now, it's fine if you are here to serve people who are at the top and that's who you want to serve. That is great. But I don't want you to be accidentally aiming your messaging there when the people you really want to deal with, or where your sweet spot of change is actually much lower, because then you've got a message and market mismatch, and that's going to create problems for you, right? And whether you're trying to put your business out in the world, or whether you're trying to do it from a change, internal change. So this now it is an urgent and important question that your audience is actively and knowingly asking. And then one other little thing I'm going to add to this question to help people check it right now is that there cannot be the word "and" in it. So it can't be, how can I do this and that? How can I do this while doing that? Right? Because remember, every decision has a story. Every action ends an argument. We've got to be, every time we are presenting an answer to this question, we have to supply an argument for it. If you put an "and" in that question, you have to make as many things as the ands are. You have to make that many arguments simultaneously, right? So if you're saying, do you want an answer to this and this and this and this and this? Well, now you have 5 arguments that you have to make simultaneously. And by the way, you have to make them equally well, because there's this thing known as the dilution effect, where the total strength of your argument will sink to the level of its weakest point. So this is why, one thing, trust me, you'll be able to add in all the other stuff later. But this is why what I call benefit bombing does not work, right? Because you're basically saying it slices, it dices, it folds your laundry. And I'm like, well, then you better have a very strong simultaneous case for all 3 of those at the same time. So to me, the best place to get started is stop wondering what the market is looking for, what's going to fly with people, whatever. What is the question that your change, your offerings, your approach, your idea exists to answer? And then make it as urgent as possible, as important as possible, and then make sure it's only one thing, and make sure that it is something and phrased in such a way that your audience would agree it is something that they actively and knowingly are looking for right now. And one last thing, it's incredibly unlikely, in fact, make it almost impossible for them to unwant the answer to that question.
Wow.
And that's how you're going to get that whole thing started. Now, that only just gets you in their consideration set. Like, the answer is where you're actually going to, if you're trying to think about this from a differentiation standpoint, the answer is how you're going to differentiate. If we're talking about a change effort, the answer is the answer, but then the real key comes into how do you make the case to connect those two. But it all gets started on that question. And that's a place where a lot of times we skip. We just kind of start out with I have an answer.
Got to start with the question.
Exactly. What question does it? You're asking someone to do something. Why would they do it? And it's not the reasons you think. It's the reasons they think. That's what we have to identify. And that starts with a question.
Wow. And this is why you need a copy of the book, friends. Littlechangebook.com. Get a copy of Say What They Can't Unhear. Get to know. There you go. Yeah, woohoo! It's real.
It is
It is
real.
real.
I know. Yes.
All right, that's just a PDF. I won't tell anybody if you don't. So
Yeah, I've got the
congratulations.
pre-release copies. Yes.
Yeah, littlechangebook.com is where you can get it. Say what they can in here and start with your question, friends. That's where you can start. Get to know Tamsen Webster more.